What's the difference between antinatalism and anti-procreationism? Well, I recently watched an episode of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast with Luca Lo Sapio. He talks about how he views the difference between these two things, and before I give my thoughts, I'm going to let him speak for himself.
Being anti-procreationist presupposes being antinatalist, but being antinatalist does not necessarily imply being anti-procreationist. So just to sum up, I think antinatalist is an axiological view about existence, according to which existence is not something valuable. Is an axiological view. Instead, anti-procreationism is a normative view, according to which we should refrain from bringing somebody into existence. I think it's important to make this distinction in order to consider the whole spectrum of antinatalist positions. For example, the Japanese philosopher Morioka, he thinks that, for example, ancient antinatalism in ancient Greece, for example, is antinatalism without being necessarily anti-procreationism. Instead, modern and contemporary antinatalism is also anti-procreationism. So, for example, David Benatar is antinatalist as well as anti-procreationist. So this is the reason why I think they should be distinct.
So Luca explains that he sees the difference between antinatalism and anti-procreationism as the former being an evaluative statement as to whether it's better to come into existence or not, i.e. it isn't, and the latter as a moral opposition to procreation that can be based off that evaluative statement, but it doesn't have to be. I agree that there is a difference between these two things, and I don't say that Luca's analysis is invalid, but I have a different one. In my understanding, anti-procreationism is just that, anti-procreation. It is the moral opposition to procreation. I think Luca and I agree here. Antinatalism, however, I don't share Luca's evaluative definition. I define antinatalism as the view that it's morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence. But now this leaves open two questions. Isn't that the same as anti-procreationism? And why is there disagreement between the definition I use for antinatalism and Luca uses? Let's deal with the first one first, and there is a difference. Anti-procreationism is the view that it is morally wrong to procreate specifically. This differs from antinatalism, as I define it, in the key way that antinatalism doesn't specify the means by which you create a new sentient being. It leaves open that means, because the means really isn't the morally relevant thing in focus here. It's the creation of the sentient being that is. Anti-procreationism focuses too much on the means rather than the creation itself. And then following on from that, antinatalism, as I define it, specifies sentient being, whereas anti-procreationism doesn't. On a more uncharitable reading, someone could read the definition of anti-procreationism and think that it applies to basically anything that can procreate, even non-sentient beings like plants. On a more charitable reading, though, I think most people would realize that anti-procreationism is specifically talking about human procreation. But I think this unduly limits the moral opposition to the creation of humans rather than all sentient beings. I've gone over why I include other animals and other sentient beings generally in antinatalism in this video, which I'll link in the description. And somewhat separate from this issue of restricting procreation to human procreation, anti-procreationism being centered around procreation means that it's generally centered around biology, as I believe procreation has a biological definition. Whereas in theory, I think antinatalism should apply to any sentient being, whether they are biological or not. Antinatalism, being a sentiocentric view, would apply to potentially sentient beings that may be digital in nature. Of course, at the point we're at now, in reality, this is a purely hypothetical case, but it still stands in theory. Now, let's deal with the second part of the disagreement about the definition of antinatalism itself. Remember, Luca defines it as the view that it is better not to come into existence, whereas I define it as I've been speaking about, the view that it is morally wrong to create sentient beings. The key difference here is that Luca's definition focuses on whether it is better for an individual to come into existence, and my definition focuses on whether it is morally permissible to create said individual. I don't think there is actually a definitive reason that one should choose one definition over the other, but there are considerations, and I'll give mine now. The question of whether it's better to come into existence or not, and the view that it isn't better to come into existence existence and the value of existence generally being negative seems to be a question that's already covered by philosophical pessimism generally. Antinatalism really comes into its own when we're talking about the morality of bringing someone into existence. For example, if someone were to think that it is bad to come into existence, but that there were countervailing considerations that made it okay to bring people into existence, or that non-procreation wasn't the appropriate response to this badness, and so they generally supported procreation or were indifferent to it, this would kind of stretch the credulity of antinatalism with this definition. Additionally, antinatalism really came into its own in the modern era with the publication of Better Never to Have Been, which has really defined antinatalism in the modern day. The definition of antinatalism that David Benatar, the author of the book, uses is the view that it is morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence.
Well, I want to provide multiple entries into the dictionary. For antinatalism, I want to have it described as an abstract noun, which is the view that it is morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence.
Another thing to consider is that people oppose procreation for reasons other than viewing coming into existence as a harm or a bad. They can think that it is morally wrong to take the risk of extraordinary suffering with someone else's welfare, the risk argument for antinatalism, or that it's wrong to create someone with a lack of consent, the consent argument for antinatalism. If someone were to oppose creating sentient beings for these reasons, under Luca's definition, they wouldn't be considered antinatalists, and this would be really strange. Now, of course, someone could accept that strangeness and maintain using this definition of antinatalism. I'm just pointing out this would be an implication. Of course, if we accept my definition of antinatalism, there are also implications that people might find strange. People may have all sorts of bizarre reasons for opposing the creation of sentient beings, and under my definition of antinatalism, they would share the label of antinatalist or subscribing to antinatalism with people like you and me. A whole variety of people with a variety of motivations would share the label antinatalist. The fact that people come to antinatalism with different motivations is something you would just have to accept under the definition I use. And personally, I'm happy with that. Hey, it's me, Lawrence, from the future. I'm just editing the video and I just realized that one thing Luca said I didn't cover, and he said that anti-procreationism presupposes antinatalism.
Being anti-procreationist presupposes being antinatalist.
By that, I think he meant that if you are morally opposed to procreation, that presupposes antinatalism, i.e. the view that you think it would be better never to have come into existence. I don't think that follows. I think that if you're morally opposed to human procreation, it doesn't specify a motivation in that definition. That view can be informed by antinatalism as Luca defines it, but being morally opposed to procreation is just that, being morally opposed to procreation. It doesn't mean that you have to be opposed to procreation for those reasons. You could be someone from the voluntary human extinction movement, which is opposed to procreation because of the impact humans have on the environment, for example. Back to the video. Like I said, there isn't a definitive reason to pick one over the other. Differences like this in the understanding of terms sometimes can't ever be settled. At the end of the day, people use terms slightly differently. We should just navigate the nuances of the term in the conversations we have where it's relevant and recognize that other people might be using the same term slightly differently. Just make sure that you understand each other by asking what they mean by that term so that you can understand if you're speaking about different things or not. If you want to see more of a discussion around the definition of antinatalism, then you can check out this panel that I was on a few months ago. I've linked it in the description. How do you see the difference between antinatalism and anti-procreationism? Do you think there's a difference? What definition of antinatalism do you use? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.